This is not a subject. Fighting hunger, feeding minds, and all that in the context of social inclusion and Ramadan and fasting and so on. When I was invited to deliver this lecture, I thought, this is not my cup of tea. Because I can give a lecture on, in fact 2 lectures, on subjects like will the Iranians make the bomb? I can give a lecture saying why they will, and another saying why they won't. And you know, I can go on doing that. But talking about this complex set of issues was not something that I thought I would be able to do. I've been thinking about some of these things, but I've never systematically put pen to paper on these issues. And frankly, I'll tell you why I agreed. I could not bring myself to say no to Iman. And she called me. And so here I am. It's been one of the most difficult speeches to prepare. Because of this, as I said earlier, trying to weave all these themes. And this is why I've decided that given the complexity of the subject, I will speak to a text that I have in front of me. This is very uncharacteristic of me. I hardly ever do that. I usually use a teleprompter, but Abdul Majid couldn't provide one. No, I was kidding. But I usually don't speak from notes in front of me, certainly not from a text. But I thought if I didn't do that on this set of subjects, you would be here till midnight, and after that food you would be probably snoring by the time I finish. The title of my talk, as Dr. Katranji mentioned, is I Have a Dream. It's in honor of the late Martin Luther King, who taught my generation how even dreams that seem impossible can be turned into reality. Yes, I have a dream, but in order to get to it, I have to go through a tortuous process of argument and analysis that is extremely complex. And that's another reason why I decided to read from the text. One caveat before I go any further. I refer in my talk to several major religious figures, but I refer to them as historical personalities, and neither endorse nor criticize their religious doctrines or the religious doctrines of their followers. So let me turn to the subject at hand. Any analysis that makes fighting hunger a central theme has to move beyond treating what I call the symptom of a social malaise and home in on the disease itself. For hunger is not the disease, but the symptom of a major disease that affects most human societies, including our own. Charity, however valuable it may be, is like using a Band-Aid or aspirin when what one needs is major surgery. This is not debunking the notion of charity, because Band-Aid and aspirin are very essential until you can properly diagnose the disease and find the right remedy. But if one gets too hung up on merely treating the symptom and making the patient temporarily comfortable, then one is likely to neglect the disease itself and allow it to fester and even become fatal. The disease of which hunger is a symptom was summed up very well by the great Indian literary figure and Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore 100 years ago. Although Tagore addressed this bar to the Indian manifestation of this disease, it has universal relevance. And although it may at first sight seem rather facetious, it is really a very profound statement. Tagore stated, "When I see a fat Indian, it makes me cry." He wasn't referring to me. I was born after he died. When I see a fat Indian, it makes me cry, for it reminds me of all those of my countrymen who have gone hungry in order to keep them well fed. But this is not a facetious statement, it's a very profound statement. The basic cause of hunger, as Tagore's statement clearly implies, is social and economic inequality that drastically reduces the purchasing power of the poor and the downtrodden. Studies have demonstrated that people who die of starvation seldom do so because there is no food in the market. They die because they do not have the capacity to buy the food that is available, especially since markets can be easily manipulated to create artificial scarcity and drive up food prices. Starvation and even famine is seldom a natural disaster. It is most often a man-made disaster, created by the reproduction of social structures that perpetuate social and economic inequality. This inequality is manifested differently in different settings and becomes visible in different forms. It often coincides with other societal divisions that reflect the relationship of domination and subordination in discrete settings. Caste in India, race in America, religious sect in the Middle East, tribe in Africa, and so on and so forth. But underlying all these surface manifestations of inequality is the dominant-subordinate relationship identified in Marxian literature as class. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, in order to tackle hunger, one must address the issue of inequality in human societies. The great religious figures whom we revere, Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha of Lumbini, Jesus of Nazareth, Muhammad of Mecca, were all not only conscious of this social malaise, but one can argue their respective messages were the products of their revulsion against this disease. They were all born into societies with very high degrees of inequality, and of inequality dominated by a parasitical class of classes that fed off the people's ignorance and apathy and presided over highly repressive political orders, often through the manipulation of religious symbols whose control they monopolized. Buddha was reacting to the sophistry of Brahmanism that divided people into castes, that were supposedly immutable, and that prevented even minimal social mobility. Jesus was born into a system marked by dual domination, one of the representatives of the Roman Empire, symbolized by Pontius Pilate, and two of a Jewish collaborationist elite, symbolized by Herod, the scribes, and the Pharisees, that had created a system of domination and subordination amongst the population of Palestine, through which they controlled society both for their benefit and for the benefit of their Roman overlords. Muhammad was born into a system where the leaders of the tribe of Quraysh, to which he belonged himself, lorded it over the people of Mecca, among other things by monopolizing control of the city's main religious sanctuary, the Kaaba, the principal shrine of pagan idolaters in all of the Arabian Peninsula, which was also the principal source of revenue for the Meccan elite, because it was the center of annual pilgrimage, called the Hajj, by pagan tribes who not only engaged in trade with, but also paid dues to the ruling cabal in Mecca that controlled the Kaaba. These systems of domination and subordination were normally concealed in religious garb and religious symbols and religious garb and religious symbols. Religious texts and or idols for worship were used as very effective instruments of perpetuating inequality. This is the reason why the ideological ancestor of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abraham, chose the breaking of idols as his primary mission. He realized that he had to use an Urdu Persian term, a but shekan, but shekan, which means an idol breaker, an iconoclast, before he could become a Khuda Parast, worshipper of the one true God. The relevance of Abraham's iconoclasm to modern times is summed up in a couplet by the great Indian poet-philosopher Mohammed Ayoob. And those of you who know Urdu will appreciate its beauty and simultaneously its social message. ये दौर अपने इब्राहिम की तलाश में है, ये दौर अपने इब्राहिम की तलाश में है, सनम खुदा है जहाँ, La ilaha illallah. The rough translation is, this epoch is in search of its own Abraham. And Iqbal was writing in the first half of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, so it's even more relevant today. This epoch is in search of its own Abraham, for the entire world has become a temple of idolatry. And then the assertion, there is no God, but the one true God. Iqbal uses the term idolatry in the same sense that Abraham must have used it. Not merely of man-made idols, of stone and clay, but more importantly, of wealth and power, for which idols, false gods, become metaphors, because this idolatry of wealth and power produces social ills such as hubris and the servitude of man to man, or of human beings to human beings. It was Abraham's iconoclasm that laid the foundation of the social revolutionary message of the tradition he founded that culminated with Jesus and Muhammad. One major reason why the social revolts that figures such as the Buddha, Jesus and Muhammad led had to adopt religious symbols was because only steel could cut steel. The teachings of Buddha, Jesus and Muhammad all contain very strong messages of social equality and the abolition of societal divisions based on caste and class. This is why, initially, it was the oppressed and the downtrodden that flocked to their banners. My reading of the New Testament, and I must say it's been quite some years since I read the New Testament, my reading of the New Testament does not reveal that any of Jesus' principal disciples were born into social privilege. The original followers of Muhammad, with very few exceptions, came from the socially disadvantaged segments of Meccan society, including slaves. Some of them were foreigners living on the margins of Meccan tribal society, which was also intensely racist in pre-Islamic times. There was Salman the Persian, Salman Farsi, Salman the Persian, one of the few literate among the initial followers of the Prophet, who transcribed many of the Quranic verses as they were revealed to the Prophet. There was Bilal, the dark-skinned Abyssinian, a freed slave who was appointed by Muhammad as the first muezzin, one who calls to prayer at his mosque in Medina, to the great chagrin of some of the Prophet's elitist Arab followers. There's a very interesting story that I heard as a kid, which still remains with me. And I think that story, it's an extremely beautiful story, although it probably couldn't be true because it challenges the laws of nature. So it's probably apocryphal, but it's a story that lays bare the ills of racism that 1,000 articles that you read would not be able to do. This was a story that I heard, which runs something like this. When Bilal was appointed the first muezzin, the first caller to prayer, and the calls to prayer were being made for several weeks, some of the Prophet's Arab followers found that this was too much, that this dark-skinned African was giving the call to prayer day after day, 5 times a day. So they went to the Prophet and said, it's not really fair to the rest of the believers that only this one person should give the call. You must order, you must rotate this. So the Prophet said, fine, and he said, one of you, he picked somebody, is going to give the call to prayer tomorrow morning. The morning prayer is just before the break of dawn. It's not dawn, just before the break of dawn. And so the next morning, one of his disciples, one of his followers goes up and gives the call to prayer. But you cannot pray until there's a certain time when you see that the dawn is almost about to break. And dawn does not break. So people wait. They wait for an hour, they wait for 2 hours, they wait for 3 hours. Finally, they go back to the Prophet and say, what's happening? How can we pray? Dawn is not breaking. And the Prophet says, God loves the voice of this Abyssinian so much that unless and until he gives the call to prayer, dawn will never break. And Bilal goes up, gives the call to prayer, and dawn breaks, and they pray. It's a wonderful story, despite the fact that it defies the laws of nature. But I think it drives home the message very clearly, of racial equality very clearly. But to get back to my text. But social revolts are, I would argue, fundamentally political acts. Those who lead such revolts are by definition political revolutionaries. For social revolts are simultaneously calls for political revolution. The overthrow of iniquitous orders, not merely the breaking of idols representing false gods. Jesus confronted the Pharisees and overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple in Jerusalem in an act of immense political significance that directly challenged the Jewish establishment, but much more, Roman power in Palestine. Jesus was crucified not because he claimed to be the Son of God. In any case, the question of his divinity was not resolved until 300 years after his death at the Council of Nicaea, when Christianity was on the cusp of becoming the established religion of the Roman Empire. Jesus was tried and crucified because the political establishment in Palestine was afraid that his revolutionary teachings were turning him into an alternative locus of political power that threatened the established order. The Romans could have dismissed as insane any claims made by his disciples that Jesus was the Son of God, but they could not take it lightly when his disciples acclaimed him the King of the Jews. The historical Jesus of Nazareth was an intensely political figure who wanted to overthrow the existing iniquitous order and paid for it with his life. His frequently quoted phrase, "Give unto God what is God's and give unto Caesar what is Caesar's," was not a call for the acceptance of Caesar's political authority and the division of the temporal from the spiritual spheres as is commonly interpreted. Extremely politically subversive statement made in a context where, according to Roman doctrine, everything belonged to Caesar, for among other things, Caesar was also God. Muhammad was more fortunate than Jesus. He escaped attempts on his life several times, including the night of his flight to Medina, when his young cousin Ali ibn Abu Talib slept in his bed to deceive the assassins who had planned to kill the Prophet that night while he was asleep. He was also fortunate because Hijaz, the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, or Mecca, or the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula where the Prophet was born, and where he lived, was a fractured society. And the control of the Quraysh did not extend much beyond the city of Mecca. He could therefore find refuge in a neighboring oasis and eventually establish a state there, of which he became the ruler. The social revolutionary and political subversive of Mecca became the lawgiver of Medina. It was the Prophet's great capacity to juggle both these roles that provided the initial dynamism to early Muslim society, a dynamism that was unfortunately frittered away soon after his death, both because of internal rifts and civil wars, and the simultaneous Arab-Muslim conquests of much of what we now call the Middle East, that turned Islam into the established religion of a vast empire, thus depriving it of much of its initial revolutionary thrust. However, the historical Muhammad cannot be blamed for the loss, for this loss, just as the historical Jesus cannot be blamed for the adoption of Greco-Roman models of thought and practice once Christianity became the established religion of the Roman Empire, and Jesus of Nazareth was acclaimed Jesus Christ. Similarly, Goddeeris cannot be blamed for the fact that he was turned into God by his followers. In fact, there was no concept of God in Buddha's teaching. He was turned into God by his followers, and worse, that in India, the Brahmanical revival co-opted Buddha as a deity in the Hindu pantheon, after stifling his revolutionary message and after the near total elimination of Buddhism from India. What happens to great religious or revolutionary figures after they pass from the scene is never under their control. Elites who become heirs to their message of social change more often than not subvert them and recreate these historical figures to suit their own objectives, which normally include the inculcation of political docility and social servitude among their followers. This process takes place at the expense of the revolutionary messages of justice and equality that these great figures preached. In more recent times, a similar fate has befallen Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. The latter's revolutionary message neutralized by the Indian elite by anointing him the Mahatma, a great soul, thus falsely attributing spiritual traits to a leader of great political acumen and social consciousness. He was literally kicked upstairs. Making icons of social revolutionaries is the best strategy to make their messages irrelevant to contemporary situations and relegate them to churches, mosques, and temples. This is a common theme one finds in human history, turning truly revolutionary figures into otherworldly ones, thereby detracting from their revolutionary message, aimed primarily at what Frantz Fanon had called the wretched of the earth. To return to my original point, and I just take 2 more minutes. To return to my original point, the persistence of hunger, of racial oppression, and political tyranny, and they all usually come together, are at bottom the symptoms of social orders based on the reproduction of deliberately engineered inequality in human society. And they cannot be eliminated unless one is willing to confront this fundamental malaise. This, I know, is a tall order, but at least it is an ideal that we must try to reach. Reality always falls short of the ideal, but it is imperative that we try at least to approximate the ideal as best as we can. The ideal should be the attainment of a society where food banks become redundant because hunger has been abolished. The ideal should be that we do not need every year to celebrate the anniversary of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, because that dream has been fulfilled and racial discrimination eliminated. The ideal should be that the followers and admirers of Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet, need not shed tears every year in the Islamic month of Muharram in memory of Islam's greatest martyr, who was brutally killed fighting tyranny, because tyranny is a thing of the past. I know this is a dream, but there is nothing wrong in having such a dream, because it is dreams that drive human beings to achieve goals that seem unattainable at first sight. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the United States are prime examples of this phenomenon. Of course, this does not mean that in the interim, while we are striving to fulfill our dream, we should not support the Greater Lansing Food Bank, which has been doing an admirable job of feeding the needy. It does not mean that in the interim, we should not agitate against racial discrimination and racial profiling. It does not mean that in the interim, we should not oppose tyranny by word and, if possible, by deed, whether it's in Egypt or in Syria. All these are extremely useful activities, but we should continue to dream as well. For those who do not dream are no better than robots. Thank you.